Okay guys, this is the official tier list for all 17 coaster locomotives, which includes the 5 F40 PHM-2Cs, the 2 F59 PHIs, and the 10 Bombardier bi-level cab cars. I will be ranking them by their horn and how much they stood out to me and how good they were in the 2000s and 2010s. So, the cab cars will not be ranked by how they are currently. I am only ranking them for how they were in the 2000s and 2010s, not the 2020s. Starting with 2101. This F40 was pretty good to me, in my opinion. It stood out pretty well. Its horn is fine, pretty average. It never got that fouled all the time, but it didn't really stand out to me too much. Its horn is alright, and I gotta give it credit for being the last ever coaster F40 to run into service in 2021, being the last F40 to retire. So, gets a B tier. Next up is 2102. This one is actually really good. I love its horn, and it sounded pretty good in 2014. In the 2000s, it sounded pretty well, had an actual tone, and the tone for it in 2012 to 2014, 2015 was really, really well. And yeah, its horn sounded really well in the 2010s, and it never got fouled. It just changed. So, A tier. And plus, it stood out more to me. Next up is 2103. This locomotive is also a really personal favorite of mine. It sounded awesome in the 2010s. Well, not as much though. And actually didn't sound very good. It sounded numb and broken. It didn't sound awful though. Not as awful as 2105's horn from 2020. But when it got put in the museum, it sounded really well. Now you're going to be like, Train guy, you're supposed to rate them from the 2000s and 2010s. I'm also meaning not their refurbishment and if they stayed the same. Because 2103 got a new horn and it sounds really well. And it got preserved. So yeah, but other than that, it still stood out to me and it sounded really good in the 2000s, but not as good in the 2010s. So, but it deserves an A tier. 2104, never really liked this one. It didn't stand out to me at all. It was pretty good in the early 2010s and definitely the 2000s. And I gotta give it some hot credit for having an M5 horn. But it didn't get too good in 2018 to 2020. Whenever its logo started fading, its horn just turned to squeak. And I don't like it. Well, it doesn't deserve a D tier, but it will get a C for having an M5 horn in the early 2000s. Okay, 2105. Perfect. Everything about this. Down to its very first day in service. It had the most breathtaking horn ever in 2000s. And in the freaking 2010s, it sounded awesome. It never got fouled until 2019. But who cares? It sounded awesome and I love this locomotive ever. It is my favorite locomotive in the whole world. Nothing beats this guy. It had an awesome M3 with an amazing quill in the 2000s, and its original K5LA is literally makes me cry. I am weakened by this amazing thing, and I saw it the most times in my life, 2016 and 2019. I only saw 2102 and 2103 once in my lifetime when I was on the trolley in 2019. I never saw 2101 and 2104, and that's another reason why they don't stand out to me. But other than that, 2105 is the best locomotive in the whole universe. S tier. Okay. I can't say anything different for the two F-59s since their horns are basically the same thing. They're fine. They sounded literally amazing in the 2000s, but in the late 2010s, they were really squeaky, and they had that after effect of a squeak to their horn, and it just sounded chunky and annoying, and it got annoying when they would have that squeak, like, oh my god, just stop blowing the horn already. They were so clear and clean in the 2000s, but over time they just weren't liking it. And they got their outskirts taken out, so now it's really hard to tell the difference between the F40 and the F-59. Should have just kept the side skirts on. They're okay. If they kept the outskirts and their horns didn't get too squeaky, then they'd get an A tier. Well, here's the thing. I actually liked the F-59 before the F-40. When I first watched the coaster video in 2016, I liked the F-59 more because it was more streamlined and stuff like that. But in 2017, after watching that 2102 video, I started liking the F-40 more. And the F-59s just seem to fade away of liking from me. I do love them though, but they don't stand out to me that much. So they're both in B tier. Alright, the cab cars now. 2301 to 2310. Starting with 2301. I'm sorry, but I do not like this cab car at all. Yeah, its horn sounded amazing in the 2000s, but it just got bad so fast. I can't use the audio right now, but there's a clip from Coaster Fan 2105 from 2009 or 2008 or something, and its horn is terrible. It doesn't even sound like a horn. So how did it get better? It didn't. They just freaking cleaned it up and that was it. It drives me nuts that it kept the same horn it had from the 1990s, I think. They just choked it. So I guess it's not 2301's fault for getting its horn that way, but that's its problem. It just didn't stand out to me at all anyway. So a D tier. Sorry, 2301 fans. Alright, 2302. It's way better than 2301. Its horn was okay in the 2010s. It sounded like a harmonica in the 2010s. But in the 2000s, it sounded great. It was so high-toned and happy and uplifting. Yeah, and I liked it. Okay in the 2010s, but awesome in the 2000s, so an A tier. Alright, 2303 is next. Its horn was absolutely hilarious in the 2010s. It was a laughing coaster until I got a K5 cocked up a K5CA horn in 2010 something, I don't know what year. I think it was like 2016 or 2017, I don't know. It sounded beautiful in the 2000s with its quill and everything. Amtrak Cal 462 has tons of videos of 2303's outstanding quilled horn. So, not as good as 2302 in the 2010s because it got a K5CA. If it kept its K5LA but not choke it too much and it was on full blast, it'd be better. So C tier. 2304 is next. Okay, 2304 is underrated. Like, really underrated. Like, yeah. In the 2000s, its horn wasn't that good. It sounded like 2306. 2304 and 2306 would have a great fight with each other over who's better. 2304 is better. It's underrated. Yeah, 2304 sounded trash in the 2000s, and 2306 was goated. But in the newer era, 2306 sounded like crap in the 2010s, but in 2011 to 2015, 2304 sounded beautiful. I can't use the audio, obviously. Even after its horn got fouled in the late 2010s, it still sounded pretty cool to me. It sounded terrifying, but it was pretty cool. Nowadays, it's awesome. It's the best cab car because it's unique. It got a K5CA in 2018, though, and that just ruined 2304 for me. But still, it sounded meh in the 2000s, but it was great in the early 2010s. So, B tier. 2305 is next. The only coaster cab car I've never seen. Just talking about 2305 makes me sad, man. I've never seen it, and now it's being turned into a coach. Its horn was meh in the 2010s, but actually pretty good. But in the 2000s, it had an awesome sounding P5, and I loved it. Yeah, other than that, 2305 is a great cab car in general. Pretty average. It's mid, okay. It would be C tier, but I gotta give it a B because of its awesome P5 it had. It's the only cab car to have a P5. So, B. 2306. Oh, 2306. I don't know what to say for you. You're both good and bad at the same time. You are overrated. 2306 is the most overrated coaster cab car. Its horn was absolutely gorgeous in the 2000s, but it didn't deserve all that hype. In the 2010s, its horn is like so easy to recreate on a piano. On a freaking piano. It's just two tones, and both of them are bad. What the heck was that horn in the 2010s? It was so quiet, so wimpy. It was wimpier than 2301's 2000's K5LA. Wimpier than 2303's 2010's K5LA. You're gonna hate me for putting it in a low tier, but I can't put it in low tier because its horn was a god from heaven in the 2000s. So, it just falls in mid. Terrible in the 2010s, but amazing in the 2000s. It didn't deserve all the hype, though. 2307 is next. This gun is actually pretty good. In the 2010s, most coaster cab cars' horns sounded like BS. Sorry for my potty mouth. But 2307 was one of the better ones. It had at least a quill. It sounds nostalgic when listening to its horn for me, because it stood out the most. When I used to watch the coaster in the 2010s, 2307 was the cab car that stood out to me the most. I never really liked it, but it stood out to me. In the 2000s, its horn was pretty average and good. So I guess I can give it an A tier for standing out to me. Its horn was pretty fouled in the 2010s, but it sounded pretty good. Okay, 2308. Yeah, I don't like this one. Its horn was beautiful for only like the first 2 years of the 2010s. Pretty great in the 2000s, but it had no tone after 2012. It was like a unfinished horn. And I kept holding my breath watching videos of it, thinking its horn would go to full blast, but no. So let's see. 2309. It's kind of like 2307. Horn stood out to me a lot in the 2010s, and it sounded pretty good in the 2000s. But it doesn't really beat 2307, so I guess I can just put it behind it, since they're basically the same thing. 2310. That horn in the 2000s was awesome. There's a video from a YouTuber where they filmed a coaster train at Cannon Road. It was going a little slow, but 2310's horn just quilled and then full blast. It was awesome. It had the best Doppler effect in the world. And it just had to die in the 2010s. So if its horn didn't get too choked and they actually fixed it and cleaned it up, it'd get an A tier. But I'm just going to put it in B tier. So there you have it, guys. The complete coaster the complete coaster locomotive 2000s to 2010s tier list. I was going to put the 1990s on this list, but the 1990s and 2000s horns both sound the exact same. And P.S., they didn't change, and they didn't blow their horns all long in the 1990s, or at least not enough footage of them. So there you have it, guys. The complete coaster locomotive tier list. 17 locomotives. So, well, thanks for watching. Train Guy out.